Hey guys, how's it going? So, today we're going to be talking about the Algerian War. Now, the Algerian War is a great example of a revolutionary war, a war of decolonization, and in fact, a guerrilla war. Now, for those of you who aren't really familiar with the terms, revolutionary war is a war that is based on a revolution, an uprising, typically one of the people against a stronger force. Decolonization is the act of moving against colonialization. So it's a country that was once under the control of another, usually larger or more powerful country, and it's basically saying we don't want this anymore. And a guerrilla war is a war in which a militarily smaller or weaker force takes on a militarily stronger force through the use of strategy. So, for example, you can have a smaller army that takes on a bigger one that has tanks and planes and all this really cool stuff, but they use smart strategies. They fight smart, they fight clever, and they end up either surviving or winning. Usually, it's surviving more than winning. But in any case, the Algerian War is a great example of such a war in the 20th century. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of an overview on what the Algerian War was specifically, and we're going to be discussing the causes in this video. The next video in this series is going to focus on the key events of the war, and the last video is going to be talking a little bit about the effects of the war. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, in terms of an overview, the Algerian War took place between 1954 and 1962. Now, it was predominantly a war between the French government and the FLN, which is the Front de Libération Nationale. I apologize for my atrocious French, but yeah, the FLN, the National Liberation Front. It would later devolve into a conflict between the French government, the FLN, and the Pieds Noirs. I'll go into who the Pieds Noirs were in a little bit. So, the idea was that France had been in control of Algeria since about 1830. Now, Algeria was a key strategic territory for the French. Obviously, like any country with a large empire, colonial holdings, they really wanted to make sure that things were done in a specific way. The French were very firm in their rule of Algeria. They weren't afraid to use violence or what was known as a scorched earth policy. They were very strong with any perceived uprising or any revolt. They regularly banned and outlawed political parties that had the goal of destabilizing their rule. So the French were pretty firm. At the same time, the French had certain concessions. So, for example, they had certain legal structures in place that allowed Algerians to apply for French citizenship if they wanted, on the condition that they would agree to be part of the French legal code. So the French thought that they were being equitable in this way, but the reality was that Algerians didn't feel like they were being treated that fairly under the French. Now here's the thing, there was a large population of French settlers that moved to Algeria and basically raised families in Algeria. Over time, these people would, after several generations, be people that had been born on Algerian soil and whose parents and grandparents even had been born on Algerian soil. So for all intents and purposes, these people were Algerian. But of course, ethnically speaking, they had different descent. And these colonists, or colons as they were known in French, were privileged in a lot of regards. Now, they were nicknamed the Pieds Noirs, the black shoes. And this basically comes from the fact that they wore cheap black shoes, and that was sort of how they were always identified. Now, the idea was lots of Algerians were unhappy that they had no real option to throw off French rule, unhappy that the Pieds Noirs had better living conditions. On average, they had better employment opportunities, they had more land ownership, they had better education, and they were unhappy that there was no real chance for them to be self-determined as a nation. Now, the French, besides like any colonial power being unwilling to give up their control, were not really willing to even consider the possibility that Algeria could be an independent country. The fact of the matter was, Algeria was, to them, just another part of France. In fact, Francois Mitterrand famously said, Algeria is France. In speeches in the National Assembly, French politicians frequently denounced the idea. And it was very atypical because even socialists in France, socialists are typically very anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism, or at least they are on paper, were very much against the idea of giving Algeria any kind of liberation. So the fact is that by 1945, France was no longer really in a position to have a massive colonial empire. They really had they had no potential. So they had already suffered several defeats militarily. They had several campaigns in which they tried to maintain their rule, and several countries that basically just broke away through diplomatic pressure. So the French weren't willing to lose another key colonial acquisition, especially not one which they considered to be part of their country. Now, the French constantly promised the Algerians after the 40s that things would change. The idea was that they had ended up losing the war and they ended up being forced to surrender to the Nazis. And the other thing was that their values, the values they supposedly, promoted, that the French had all these ideas about, liberty, equality, and fraternity were, they were incompatible. You couldn't basically, have this philosophy of liberty and equality and fraternity of them say people all have equal rights and then also rule over someone else's nation. So in the Brazzaville Conference in 1944, which was a big conference that the Free French government held to sort of determine the future status of colonized nations, they proposed changes. They proposed that colonized nations would be more politically active with the French. They proposed that instead of calling it the French Empire, they would rename it the French Union. The idea was that they would make steps to sort of improve the situation. But the fact of it was, Algerians were not really, they weren't really given anything significant. It was just lip service. So even though you had Wilson's 14 Points in 1917, which was this document put out by the U.S. president that very strongly advocated for self-determination of peoples, for peoples to be able to sort of control their own future. Even though you had that, and even though you had the UN Charter, you had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you had all these documents, all of these meetings, all of these conferences that basically came back to this idea that all human beings deserve equal rights, the French were not really committed to it. And the Algerians were very aware of this. So in 1942, Ferhat Abbas was one of the first activists to sort of propose the idea of a self-government. And the French started, making promises to the Algerians. And of course, this is why it's been nicknamed the era of broken promises. Eventually, Algerians became disillusioned. They weren't really sure that the French were going to do what they said they were. So obviously, at this stage, you had a number of Algerian activist groups on all parts of the political spectrum. You had socialist groups, communist groups, you had Muslim groups, obviously. And many of them started vying for Algerian independence, or at the very least, a restructuring of the relationship with France. Now, things got ugly in 1945 on VE Day. VE Day was Victory in Europe Day. It was the day that celebrated the Nazi surrender on the 8th of May in 1945, and things started well enough, but obviously they didn't go well because after long enough, during the parade in the cities of Sétif and Goulama, there was a series of clashes with the police. Basically, some Algerians had signs, and these signs had placards in favor of Algerian nationalism, right? So they were marching, and they were like, "Oh, this is great, march to the French, who are basically our guys." They finally, they were victorious, and the Nazis are down. But then some people showed up with signs that said, "Oh, we want to free Algeria, we want this or that." It's a protest. People are going to sort of do their own thing. So the idea was that as a result of these clashes, Algerian activists started going out into towns and villages and attacking Pieds Noirs, the colonists, and really just attacking pretty much anybody they could find. Now, they would kill upwards of 100 people, and I think it was close to 120 people they killed. And the reprisal was brutal. The French government sent paratroopers, they sent troops. The Pieds Noirs themselves started arming themselves and going in gangs. And the idea was it just turned very ugly. It got to the point where people who weren't even responsible in the original violence were being rounded up and summarily executed, which is a fancy word for they were tied up and they were shot in cold blood. So the idea was, the Algerians were just, they were fed up. They had enough. Now, in 1954, a new group was established. There had been lots of different colonial groups that were established throughout Algeria. And this group was the Front de Libération Nationale. As I mentioned earlier, in my just terrible, terrible French. Now, the FLN was more organized, it was more dynamic, and it also benefited from the fact that the newly independent Egypt allowed them to set up shop and start planning their next move. They were very efficient. By October, they had set up, and most of the main members, like Ferhat Abbas and Ben Bella, would basically end up joining. And by November, they enacted their plan. So the idea was they believed that the only way they were going to get the French out of Algeria was to sort of, use violence. So that was kind of their plan. Now, initially, it wasn't really that successful, but the FLN proved to be tenacious. They got a lot of, control and support from the Algerian people, and they would end up convincing most other Algerian parties to join them and to join their cause. So in 1954, the Toussaint Rouge, the All Saints' Day, this marked the beginning of the Algerian War. So to just sort of recap, why was it? Big picture wise, the Algerians just weren't very happy with the fact that they were being ruled over by the French, and the French were unwilling to really restructure this agreement. Add to that the fact that most Algerians of Arab or African descent were living in poverty, while French people who moved and settled and sort of started families in Algeria, the Pieds Noirs as they were called, were living really well. And on top of that, one thing I forgot to mention was that the Algerians served in the French army in World War I and World War II. They sent their own people to fight and often die. And the idea was that they weren't being given anything to show for it. So the fact is that all this disillusionment led people to sort of forsake the political process and say, well, you know what? If France isn't going to give us what we want, then we're going to be forced to take it by force. And that is sort of what happened. In November of 1954, the FLN staged its guerrilla warfare and then issued a proclamation declaring that they wanted a free Algeria that was made in accordance with Muslim principles. Even though they were mostly socialist, they were very careful to include, Muslims and to make sure that they were running on a Muslim platform. So, key ideas that you guys need to remember. Obviously, you need to know who the Pieds Noirs were and why there was so much resentment towards them. You need to know about France's history in Algeria. You need to know about, I would say, most of the key events in the 1940s and the 1950s. I've only mentioned a couple to sort of give you guys an overview. And I would say you sort of have to understand the very unique relationship that the French had with Algeria and why they were so unwilling to give up control. So by and large, the war was caused by the Algerian desire for freedom, independence, self-determination. But besides that, you have to sort of take a look at some of the smaller events and understand that the Algerians resorted to war because, the FLN resorted to war and kind of brought the rest of the Algerians on board. And they did so because they didn't believe there was any hope for them to achieve what they wanted politically. So I hope this guide has been helpful. I will include some links in the description below to help you guys. I believe that covers most of the main points. Obviously, if you guys have any follow-up questions, please leave them in the comments. And I'll also leave some of my personal information in case you guys need to check out some of my online resources or get in touch with me for just some more assistance, anything that you might think of. In any case, thank you guys very much. And, good luck with your exams.